Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. I'm Julia Lamb. I'm a professor of theology here at Georgetown University. Thank you for coming to the 9th annual James M. and Margaret H. Costan Lecture in Early Christianity. It's so nice to have you here on this really beautiful October day. This lectureship was established with three main objectives in mind: to honor leading scholars and to celebrate their contributions to the field, to fund an annual public lecture on early Christianity that would bring together the academy, the general public, and religious communities, and finally to support both the study and the teaching of early Christian literature, history, and practice. On behalf of the university, its College of Arts and Sciences, and the Department of Theology and Religious Studies, I want to thank Jay and Margaret. Thank you for your generous gift, and thank you for your personal presence and support. Please join me in thanking you. It's a special treat to have you here because last year they both had COVID, so they saw it via live stream. So it's just nice to be all in person now. I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors for this year's lecture, the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, which has been so generous in its technological and logistical support. I'm so grateful. Thank you for that. And also thank you to the Office of Mission and Ministry, and especially Mark Bosco of the Society of Jesus for letting us use this beautiful space that is Dahlgren Chapel. We are deeply honored to have Luke Timothy Johnson as our Costan lecturer this year. He is the Robert W. Woodruff Professor Emeritus of New Testament and Christian Origins at Emory University's Candler School of Theology. I've asked my colleague, Alan Mitchell, himself a scholar of the New Testament and Christian Origins, to introduce Professor Johnson to us. Alan? And may I ask you also, may I remind you to please silence your phones as well. Thank you.
Welcome. Good afternoon. On this feast of St. Luke the Evangelist, I'm very pleased to welcome and introduce our speaker for the 9th Annual Costan Lecture in Early Christianity. As you just heard, Luke Timothy Johnson is the Robert W. Woodruff Professor Emeritus of New Testament and Christian Origins at Candler School of Theology, Emory University in Atlanta. He's been there for 24 years. Before that, he was on the faculty of Indiana University in Bloomington, Illinois for 10 years, and before that, he was at Yale Divinity School for 6 years. He is a good friend whom I have known for 44 years. Professor Johnson has authored 35 books, among which are 6 major commentaries on New Testament books, 75 articles, scholarly articles, 100 popular articles, and over 200 book reviews. In addition to being a superb scholar, he is an amazing teacher. As a doctoral student at Yale, I had the good fortune to be one of a cohort of Professor Johnson's teaching assistants for a 2-semester introduction to the New Testament that enrolled 180 Yale Divinity students. He is a dynamic and energetic professor, holding his students' interest and attention and fostering in them a love for the New Testament. He was also a dedicated mentor for us, his teaching assistants. We met often to discuss the progress of the course, and he scrutinized our assessment of the students' work and was not shy in offering the criticisms that were needed. Working with Professor Johnson was a golden opportunity for those of us who were destined to be college or university professors. His lectures became a published introduction to the New Testament under the title The Writings of the New Testament, which is now in its 3rd edition. For some time now, I have been using this text for the New Testament part of my Introduction to Biblical Literature course. In 2021, Professor Johnson published a memoir entitled The Mind in Another Place, My Life as a Scholar. Although I thought I knew him well, I learned so much more about him when I read this book. In it, he describes his entire career, In it, he describes his entire career through recollections of the many places his mind has been. It should be noted that his intellectual journey was always intentional. It should also be noted that many of the places to which his mind has gone were not simply discovered by him, he actually created those places. In his own words, he has a natural instinct to be independent, contrarian, and even polemical as a scholar. To be clear, Professor Johnson never understood this instinct to be a matter of temperament or a hostile reflex to innovation. Rather, it helped him to put into perspective some of the things that were happening in our field that he felt needed to be addressed. This instinct is also in part responsible for his many accomplishments that have changed the landscape of the study of the New Testament. Were I to catalog all of them, there would be no time for us to listen to his lecture. But I cannot resist giving some examples. When he noticed that the religious experience of early Christians was missing from the interpretation of the New Testament, he went to that place and wrote about the many instances in the New Testament where the religious experience could be found among the people for which it had been written. As a literary critical interpreter of the New Testament, Professor Johnson challenged the limitations of the standard interpretation among many New Testament scholars. The method was the historical critical method, which he found wanting. Instead of using an historical approach to dissect New Testament texts by doing mirror readings that would identify underlying polemics or opponents to be dealt with by New Testament authors, or the division of New Testament books into partitions or fragments, he preferred to examine the rhetorical structure and the narrative argument that brought a literary unity to a given book, which addressed that religious experience of early Christians. One of his most notable ventures was to take on the infamous Jesus Seminar, which sought to present the real Jesus through an historical method that tilted towards inventive speculation. He countered the seminar's claims with the publication of The Real Jesus, the misguided quest for the historical Jesus and the truth about the traditional Gospels. Whereas the Jesus Seminar sought to discover the real Jesus in a faith-free and value-free environment, Professor Johnson called its members to task by demonstrating that the real Jesus is not one recoverable by scholarly methods, but one accessible to the eyes of faith. Quite a storm ensued after the publication of that book, confirming Professor Johnson's instinct for the polemical. Still, students in my Portraits of Jesus in the New Testament course enjoyed reading that slim volume. In his study of Paul, Professor Johnson challenged the growing consensus that Paul authored only 7 letters attributed to him in the New Testament canon. He argued that those letters viewed as non-Pauline could have been authorized by Paul, thus maintaining the integrity of the canonical Paul. He has written a 2-volume work entitled The Canonical Paul, the first volume of which, The Construction of Paul, I assigned to the students in my Advanced New Testament seminar on the Pauline epistles. I have to thank him for writing so many books that I can have used in my courses. As I've reached the time allotted for me for this introduction, please join me in welcoming Professor Johnson to deliver the 9th Annual Costan Lecture entitled Christianizing the Classics, John Cassian on Friendship. Be prepared to find your minds in another place.
Good evening. Can you hear me okay? Thanks, Alan. That was very lovely. It's an honor to give the 2023 Costan Lecture. I appreciate, in particular, everybody coming out, and for me to have an opportunity to speak to and with you about a topic that may seem a trifle obscure, maybe possibly even more than a little obscure, but which I think has some significance for our understanding of antiquity and perhaps even of ourselves. I'd like to consider with you this evening or afternoon, an example of how classical culture was transmitted and transformed by Christian writers by examining John Cassian's conference on friendship. My goal is partly to show how the important topic of friendship was given a distinctive Christian coloration. But partly it is also to complicate our usual reading of Western cultural history, which runs something like this. Greco-Roman culture, that peculiar mix of elements from classical Greece and Republican Rome, was supplanted and suppressed by Christianity, leading, above all in the West, to centuries of cultural darkness, symbolized by monasticism. Only the Renaissance, with its rediscovery of the classics, brought a hope of renewal and eventually an age of enlightenment, whose blessed heirs are you and I. A more factual version is both messier and more interesting. In fact, Christianity was, from the beginning, as much Greco-Roman as it was Jewish. And for some 5 centuries, Christians actively engaged the circumambient Greco-Roman culture. The greatest Christian thinkers and writers, Clement, Origen, Athanasius, Basil, the 2 Gregories, Chrysostom, Jerome, and Augustine, were all steeped in the language, the literature, the rhetoric, and the philosophy of Greco-Roman culture. They read Scripture pretty much the way that Hellenistic philosophers read Homer and Hesiod. They wrote apologies according to the rules of Greco-Roman forensic rhetoric. They made theological arguments in the manner that pagans made philosophical arguments, while maintaining a fierce opposition to the myths and practices of paganism. Patristic writers nevertheless transmitted classical culture even as they sought to transform it. In Byzantine Christianity, centered in Constantinople, such cultural transmission and transformation continued for another 1,000 years, until the fall of that city in 1453. The great University of Constantinople, founded in 425 by Theodosius II, had 31 chairs, 15 in Latin and 16 in Greek, teaching the full range of ancient philosophy, mathematics, and rhetoric. Even in the Latin West, writers like Jerome, Augustine, and John Cassian, all of whom explicitly repudiated what was then still a pervasively pagan world, transmitted important elements of Greco-Roman culture by transforming it according to the mind of Christ. So before analyzing the late 4th and early 5th century monk Cassian's conference on friendship, I want to provide a little context by asking, who is John Cassian and what is the topic of friendship anyhow? John Cassian was an exact contemporary of Augustine. His dates are 360 to 435. He was born in the eastern part of the empire, Dacia, in present-day Romania. His education was wider and his travels considerably more extensive than those of his North African counterpart. In contrast to Augustine, John Cassian seldom spoke about himself. But in one passage, he suggests his classical education by alluding to the difficulty he had in prayer of ridding himself of the poetic images that he had learned as a youth. Unlike Augustine, who was a master of Latin rhetoric but could manage only rudimentary Greek, the language of the greater empire, Cassian could speak and write both Latin and Greek and possibly Egyptian. He spent 25 years traveling with his older friend Germanus. He went to monastic sites in Palestine and in Egypt, where he and Germanus would gather the wisdom of the desert sages. A follower of the great Alexandrian teacher Origen and the theologian Evagrius of Pontus, Cassian predictably got embroiled in the theological controversies surrounding those figures, and he fled to Constantinople, seeking refuge with John Chrysostom. But when that patriarch was himself exiled in 404, Cassian fled to Rome. He was ordained a priest by Pope Innocent I, and around 415 established the monastic community of St. Victor in Marseille. Sometime around 420, in response to invitations from bishops in Gaul, he first composed a work called the Monastic Institutes in 12 books, and then the Conferences in 24 books, 24 discourses on the spiritual life put into the mouths of the desert monks. Cassian wrote these works in Latin, but they were speedily translated into Greek, and in both East and West, Cassian's writings profoundly shaped monastic culture. The Rule of Benedict, for example, made the reading of Cassian mandatory for Lectio Divina. That's Cassian. Now a quick look at friendship. Friendship, as Alan well knows from his own work, friendship was a highly esteemed relationship in classical culture, and its peculiar features fascinated philosophers like Aristotle, Cicero, Seneca, Epicurus, and Plutarch. Friendship was regarded as distinctive because it was a relationship that involved deliberate choice, affection, reciprocity, and loyalty. Unlike commercial transactions, friends thought in terms not of self-advantage, but of mutual advantage. Commonplace maxims expressing the ideals of friendship can be traced all the way back to the dramatist Euripides, and such maxims recur frequently in the philosophical discussions. Two features of friendship are particularly stressed. The first is the theme of similarity, or identity. Friendship involves a sort of intimacy different than that among family members or lovers. Friends, it was said, are one soul, and the friend is, quote, another self. The idea is perfectly expressed by the 20th century French writer Saint-Exupéry when he says that while lovers gaze into each other's eyes, friends gaze together in the same direction. The second theme is that of equality. Friendship, says Aristotle, is equality, isotes. From this it follows that friends share everything with each other. Friendship, Aristotle says again, is fellowship, koinonia, commonality. The logic of the maxim, friends hold all things in common, extends to mutuality in both spiritual and material things. Friends thought the same way, valued the same things, shared the same view of the world. Naturally, they also shared all their material goods with complete trust and confidence. Such was the ideal. Among Greeks and Romans, then, the greatest threat to friendship was the vice of envy. Envy, says Aristotle, is a certain sorrow, lipe, caused by the perception that someone else has something I do not, therefore diminishing myself. Envy introduces into human relationships inequality. I need to be more, and competition, I need to take what I need to be more. Friendship then was great and noble, but it was also fragile because it depended on the character of the friends themselves. For this reason, the philosophers agreed that genuine friendship was possible only among the truly virtuous. Now, should we be surprised to find a conference on this classic topic of friendship placed in the mouth of a desert monk? Our surprise perhaps should be lessened when we realize how Cassian's entire work stood within the broad stream of Greco-Roman hortatory literature. The very idea of living a common life, as monks did, was, after all, Greek rather than Jewish in origin. And utopian communities, such as the Pythagorean, were grounded on the very principle of friendship. Friends hold all things in common, a trope that is employed by Luke in the description of the first Christian community in Acts 4:32 to 37. Drawing up a rule for those living together for monks, such as we find in Pachomius and in the first 5 books of Cassian's Institutes, likewise had precedent in Pythagorean practice, as well as among certain Jews who sought a purer life in the desert, such as the Therapeutae in Egypt and the Essenes at Qumran. Both communities were strongly influenced by Pythagorean ideas. The close analysis of vices that takes place in books 5 to 12 of the Institutes finds its best antecedent in the moral teachings, the moralia, of the Greco-Roman philosopher Plutarch, and in the tractate on the virtues by the Hellenistic Jew Philo of Alexandria. And in his discussion of the vices, Cassian consistently employs the favorite metaphors of Hellenistic moralists, the athletic and the medical. As for the forms of Cassian's conferences themselves, the handing on of wisdom by elders has precedent in the Greek version of the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, in which each discourse is organized according to a particular virtue or vice, just as in Cassian. And Cassian's use of a loose dialogical format, questions from the younger, answered in extenso by responses by the elder, finds its exact parallel in Cicero's De Amicitia, on friendship. Cassian ascribes Conference 16, bearing the title De Amicitia, on friendship, to Abbot Joseph. And his introduction provides some preliminary clues as to the distinctive character of this discourse. Abbot Joseph, he tells us, was not dwelling in a wilderness cave, but, he says, quote, came from a very distinguished family and was the leading man of his town in Egypt, which is called Tmus. So utterly fluent was he, not only in Egyptian, but also in the Greek language, that he would speak very beautifully, both with us and with those who were completely ignorant of the Egyptian tongue, by himself and not through an interpreter, as others did, end quote. Joseph was, in short, a Christian monk steeped in Greco-Roman culture and standing. Cassian does not introduce any of the other fathers with a similar emphasis on social standing and Greco-Roman culture. He has Joseph initiate the conversation by asking Cassian and Germanus whether they were brothers. when told that they had traveled for years, quote, united in a tie of spiritual, not carnal, brotherhood, end quote, Joseph begins his discourse on friendship. A reader of Cicero's De Amicitia, or Cicero himself, would have been completely at home in Joseph's opening remarks, where he distinguishes genuine friendship among all other forms of human and animal association, such as a casual acquaintance based on a recommendation, a bargain or an agreement of exchange, a similarity in business or art or study, and even the ties of nature and law that link together members of a family or a tribe. Such associations are easily broken through separation in space, forgetfulness, distraction. But the indissoluble form of love, he uses the Latin term caritas, is found among those having, quote, a similarity of virtue. He says, quote, the sure and indissoluble union of friendship is where the tie consists only in the likeness of goodness, end quote. Immediately then, Cassian advances four basic elements of the Greco-Roman understanding of friendship. It is distinct among human associations. It is based upon similarity or a likeness. It is most authentic and enduring among the virtuous. And fourth, it involves what Cicero calls mutual goodwill and affection. But even in this familiar territory, Cicero would be startled by Cassian's making the friends' similarity of virtue reside, quote, in their burning love for Christ, end quote. And he speaks of friendship as next to wisdom. Excuse me, I have to correct that. Cicero would be startled by Cassian's making the friends' similarity of virtue reside in their burning love for Christ. Even though Cicero's famous definition of friendship speaks of a consensus in all things human and divine, and he speaks of friendship as next to wisdom, the best thing given to humans by the immortal gods, his understanding of the divine would not have included devotion to a crucified Jewish Messiah. Like Plutarch, Cicero considered religious observance primarily as maintaining the world of gods and men, that is, society. A burning love for Christ would have seemed to him excessive, possibly subversive, certainly superstitious. Already in his third paragraph, then, Cassian alerts us to the massive transformation of the cultural ideal that he is transmitting to his monastic readers. A Greco-Roman reader would have been startled as well by the authorities to which Abbot Joseph appeals throughout his discourse. Plutarch and Cicero appealed to the example of great friendships from antiquity, such as that between Damon and Pythias, or that between Gaius Laelius and Scipio Africanus. In contrast, Joseph makes constant reference to the Old and New Testaments. Beginning in chapter 3 with the citations from the Psalms, quote, the Lord makes those of one mind to dwell in a house, end quote. End quote. Behold how good and pleasant it is for brothers to dwell in unity, end quote. Note how these verses pick up the notes of unity and one mind that express the Greco-Roman ideal, but now as they are expressed by Scripture. Joseph's discourse, indeed, is studded with scriptural citations, 23 from the Old Testament, primarily the prophetic and wisdom literature, and 34 from the New Testament, especially John, Matthew, and the letters of Paul. A powerful point is thereby made. Christians share the cultural value of friendship, but they find its basis and its true nature in the wisdom that comes from God. It is not by accident that Joseph early on quotes the foundational text of Acts 4:32, "The multitude of believers had one heart and soul, and none of them said that what he possessed was his own, but all things were common to them." Abbot Joseph's conference veers from the classical treatment even more dramatically. Rather than simply praise friendship and enumerate the benefits that it brings to its elite participants, Joseph places friendship under God's gaze and focuses upon the kinds of virtue required for authentic and lasting friendship. Friendship is to be a relationship between fellow Christians, burning with love for Christ, whose virtue is measured by the mind of Christ. He begins by listing 6 qualities demanded of the true friend that would have struck Cicero as peculiar. First, a contempt toward all worldly possession, which must be regarded as of less worth than the love of a brother. Second, a pruning of self-regard and preference for one's own opinions over that of the neighbor. Third, an estimation of all things, even those useful and necessary, as subordinate to the blessing of love and peace. Fourth, we're going to return to this one, a realization that all anger, for any reason, good or bad, must be rejected. Fifth, the effort to cure any wrath held by a brother against him, however unreasonable, the vexation of another is as bad for him as if it came from his own anger, and he must remove it from a brother's mind. Sixth, and I keep on using brother because that's in the text, and these were male monks of the desert, so the language is exclusive rather than inclusive. Sixth, and most basic, the daily reflection that he is to depart this world, therefore stand under God's judgment. We learn from this list, first, that Joseph's intent is not descriptive, but prescriptive. He instructs Cassian and Germanus in the way of thinking and acting proper to those dedicated to Christ. We see, second, that he slips easily from using the term friendship, amicizia, to the term love, caritas, which enables him to engage all of Scripture's rich testimonies on love. We see, third, that in contrast to the classical understanding, which saw envy as the destroyer of friendship, Cassian makes anger the great enemy. Quote, "It must be believed that nothing is more destructive than anger and vexation, and nothing more beneficial than love," end quote. Oddly, though, Joseph frequently speaks of anger between friends as arising from what he calls tristitia, translated as vexation, or perhaps better, a sadness, which echoes the term Aristotle used to define envy, lipe. The absence of envy in this discussion is puzzling. Love and affection. As the discourse continues, the Greco-Roman ideal of friendship is steadily reshaped. Friendship is not simply the agreement with goodwill and affection between two people. God enters the relationship, literally. The love that obtains in the friendship of monks, Joseph asserts, is the love of God. Quoting 1 John, he asserts that love not only belongs to God, but is God, so that the one who abides in love abides in God. He then draws from Paul to affirm that the love of God has, in fact, been shed in our hearts by the Holy Spirit, which Joseph states is equivalent to saying that God is shed in our hearts by the Holy Spirit. This is the Spirit who intercedes for the saints in prayer. But then, Joseph makes, I think, a fascinating distinction between the love that we owe to everybody, including enemies, and the love that we can direct to select others or friends. He distinguishes agape, Cicero's goodwill, and affectus, Cicero's benevolence. He notes that such affection differs when applied to parents, wives, siblings, or children. Each relationship makes its own claims of affection. Such partiality in affection, Joseph justifies by appeal to the patriarch Jacob, who loved all his children, yet loved Joseph with a deeper affection. He appeals as well to the special love that Jesus himself showed toward John the Evangelist. The abundance of Jesus' affection for the beloved disciple did not diminish his agape toward the other disciples, but it was the great virtue of John that drew Jesus' greater affection. Cassian has Joseph conclude this section with this declaration, quote, "For this is a properly ordered love." Sounds like Augustine, doesn't it? This is a properly ordered love, which, while hating no one, yet loves some still more by reason of their good qualities. Although it loves everyone in a general way, nevertheless it makes an exception for itself of those whom it should embrace with particular affection. And again, among those who are the highest and chief in this love, it chooses for itself some who are set apart from the others by extraordinary affection, end quote. Now we start to get to the problems. Maintaining spiritual unity. Cassian and his spokesperson, Abbot Joseph, is a realist about such spiritual friendships. They are fragile and can easily dissolve through differences at the intellectual level, through a disparity of ideas or political allegiances, or at the emotional level, through the outbreak of anger. His advice on these issues draws us even deeper into the Christian reshaping of friendship. Joseph devotes chapters 8 to 12 into the resolution of disputes over thoughts and words. Friends should not insist that their view is the correct one. Such insistence on one's own judgment, he says, invites the deceptions of the devil. But they should submit their disagreement to the discernment of the elders in the community. The smarter partner, and he uses this term, the smarter partner is not always right. It is possible, he says, that, quote, a person who has a slower wit and less prestige perceives some things more truly and correctly, end quote. In line with Paul's exhortation in Philippians to seek the good of the other more than one's own, the smarter friend should have the humility to submit to the discernment of the others. Joseph, in fact, cites the example of Paul himself, who went up to Jerusalem to submit his ministry to his fellow apostles, even though, Cassian says, Christ himself spoke through through Paul. Now, two things strike us about this short discussion. The first is that Cassian did not think of friends operating in isolation, but within the context of an ecclesial community. The elders, as a group, here function much as had the council in Jerusalem in the Acts of the Apostles. Friends need to appeal their intellectual differences to those in authority and to heed their discernment. The second is that Cassian is not romantic about the equality of friends. Some partners are smarter and stronger than others, an inequality that is less a matter of choice than of nature. Such imbalance can especially upset the weaker partner, manifesting itself in the emotion of anger, the discussion of which takes up the entire last section of Joseph's discourse, a full 12 chapters. Anger deserves such attention, for it is a most difficult topic. As Theodore Rubin said many years ago, it is the hardest virtue, not only for ancient monks, but for people in all ages and circumstances. Cassian insists that anger is a relational issue and must be dealt with relationally in the sight of and under the judgment of God. If I am angry at my friend, or know that my friend is angry at me for good cause or bad, I cannot avoid dealing with it by maintaining silence or going off and praying the Psalms. In a remarkable turn, Cassian makes me accountable both for my own anger and that of my brother or sister. Referring to Matthew 5:22-24 in the Sermon on the Mount, he recounts Jesus declaring, quote, "Whoever is angry with his brother is in danger of judgment," end quote. Yes, but then also, if you remember that your brother has anything against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go your way. First be reconciled with your brother and then come offer your gift. It is not enough that I purge myself from anger. I must also be reconciled with the one who is angry at me. It does not matter if my friend is correct in his complaint or vexation, for his anger prevents his own prayer from being heard and mine as well, so long as I refuse to be reconciled with him because of my stubborn pride. And Cassian says that, or Joseph says that the person who will not seek that reconciliation is like the ones that St. James calls, not doers, but judges of the law. They only do those parts of the law that they want to do. With impressive, I think, psychological insight, Cassian has Abbot Joseph describe ways in which the obligation to reconcile with a friend is avoided by behaviors that you and I would call passive-aggressive, covert manifestations of anger. I've already noted pious silence. What sort of thing is it that we sometimes think that we are patient because when we are aroused, we disdain to respond, but mock our irritated brothers by a bitter silence or by a derisory movement or gesture in such a way that we provoke them more to anger by our taciturn behavior than we would have been able to incite them by passionate abuse. End quotation. We think we are not guilty before God because we didn't say anything wrong. But Cassian says God judges the heart and the intention, and God sees that I was, quote, wishing to acquire glory for myself from my brother's perdition, end quote. Moreover, my passive aggression actually increases my brother's anger and therefore my liability. He says, quote, with feigned patience often arouses a still more bitter wrath than does a word. Another passive-aggressive ploy is ostentatious fasting, refusing to eat as a way of showing that we are hurt. Still another is the showy display of evangelical patience by literally turning the other cheek when struck in anger. A gesture, Cassian says, that only serves to inflame another's anger even further. It fails in true evangelical perfection because it is precisely an anger response to anger. God does not look at the outward act, but at the mind and purpose of the doer. And he goes into an interesting interpretation. By the other cheek, Jesus does not mean the other side of the physical face, but one's inner disposition. It is inner tranquility of heart that enables us to submit to those who strike us out of anger and, quote, by submitting to their mistreatment, urge those who have been aroused by their wickedness to return to calm, now that they are sated with their blow. Thus we shall conquer rage with our mildness, end quote. Such gentleness enacts Paul's exhortation, quote, be not overcome with evil, but overcome evil with good. By such genuine selflessness, Abbot Joseph says, one shows that, quote, apostolic love, which seeks not her own, but the things of another, referring here to 1 Corinthians 13:5. Now, my final section, you will be glad to hear, is on the pattern of Christ. This allusion to Paul's discourse on love in 1 Corinthians 13 leads Abbot Joseph to a discussion of the weak and the strong, a discussion that everywhere echoes Paul's distinctive vision of Christ-like love, a vision that would have seemed as alien to the ancient philosophers as it does to present-day readers, based as it is not on human calculation, but on the pattern of Jesus, who, as Paul states in Romans, died for us while we were still sinners. The recognition that in a friendship one partner can be spiritually stronger than another itself challenges the premise that friends are one soul and hold all things in common. An inequality of character, even among those committed to God, is a fact of life. Cassian shows great psychological insight when he observes that, quote, the character of the weak is consistently of this sort. They quickly and easily pour out abuse and sow discord, but they themselves do not wish to put up with the slightest mistreatment, and although they carry on violent arguments and getting on their high horse without any fear of the consequences, they are unwilling to bear small and indeed even minor things, end quote. Their very tendency to rage reveals their weakness rather than their strength. He notes, quote, for a weak person will never put up with another weak person, nor will someone who is sick be able to endure someone else who's ailing in the same way. Rather, it is the one who is himself not subject to infirmity who bestows healing on the infirm, end quote. Cassian perceives with Paul that in a condition of alienation, someone has to move. And it cannot be the weak. They are too self-preoccupied. They are too weak to move. Reconciliation cannot come from them. It must come from the one strong enough to bear with a weak friend. Who is such a strong one? Quote, as a rule, the one who submits his own will to a brother's acts the stronger part than he who is obstinate in defending and holding on to his own opinions. Such letting go of one's own will, Cassian asserts, fulfills the apostles' command, quote, you who are strong should put up with the infirmities of the weak. And, again, Paul, Bear one another's burdens, and you will fulfill the law of Christ. The law of Christ is not a commandment pronounced by Jesus, so much as the very pattern of life that he displayed, a life given for others. Abbot Joseph recognizes, he is nothing if not realistic, that such a bearing of burdens also has its limits, as when the weak partner, quote, sustained by the forbearance of the person who is well and daily declining to a worse state, comes to the conclusion that he himself ought no longer to put up with, or else that it would be better for him to depart at some time or another, once he becomes aware of his neighbor's remarkable patience and the deterioration caused by his own impatience, rather than to be constantly put up with because of another's magnanimity. End quote. Until that point, the strong friend should, in the face of the weak one's rage, recall the joy of past love, and in his mind look forward to the restoration of peace, fashioned anew, even at the moment of distress. The strong friend, then, engages rather than flees from the anger of the weak friend. The memory of past love and the contemplation of future reconciliation serves to deflect the anger directed at the strong. Cassian speaks of such a hanging in with an angry friend and allowing the weak partner's rage to dissipate as, quote, an enlargement of the heart that combines patience with empathy. Taking his lead from Romans 12:19, where Paul says, "Do not avenge yourselves, beloved, but give place to anger," Cassian interprets in this way, quote, "You should never incline to vengeance under the influence of wrath, but give place to anger." This means that your hearts should not be confined within the narrow limits of impatience and faint-heartedness, so that they will be unable to endure a violent and tempestuous disturbance when that occurs. Rather, you should be enlarged in your hearts, receiving the adverse waves of wrath in the broad harbor of love, which suffers all things, bears all things. Here alluding to 1 Corinthians 13:7. Thus your mind, enlarged by a breath of forbearance and patience, will have within itself salutary recesses of counsel, whereby the foul vapor of wrath, once having been taken in somehow and having spread, will disappear. The weak friend, weak because his anger cannot be controlled, is not abandoned, but is, by the patience and empathy exercised by the stronger friend, given strength. My conclusion. John Cassian's conferences are a largely neglected resource when compared to the works of his contemporaries, Augustine of Hippo and John Chrysostom. His concern for the shaping of a monastic form of discipleship might appear as small-bore and parochial. Certainly, he does not pretend to adjudicate, as Augustine did in the City of God, all of pagan culture. For that very reason, I think, he provides a striking example of how, even among desert monks who have fled the world, the ideals of Greco-Roman culture were transmitted even as they were transformed. And I've tried to show in this presentation elements both of transmission and of transformation. Transmission, we've seen how Cassian's presentation of Abbot Joseph, his choice of genre, and the way of life he addresses all have Greco-Roman precedents, as does the very topic of friendship addressed by the elder. In general terms, moreover, his understanding of friendship conforms to the discussion of Aristotle and Cicero, not least in his insistence that authentic and enduring friendship is only possible among the virtuous. The lines of continuity, once we look for them, are clear. The Greco-Roman ideal of friendship was transmitted through Cassian to the monastic culture of Western and Eastern Christianity. I've also noted, however, the profound ways in which that ideal was transformed. Friends stand under the judgment of God, who sees their hearts as well as their words and actions. The common value binding friends is their commitment to Christ. And the love they share is at the deepest level not only the affection that arises from similarity, but the love of God that has been poured into their hearts by the Holy Spirit. The pages of the Old and New Testaments, read as a source of wisdom, provide the guidance required for genuine friendship. The opposite of friendship is anger rather than envy. And following the pattern of Christ, who died for humans while they were still weak and sinful, the stronger partner must take responsibility for seeking reconciliation when anger disrupts spiritual unity. In all these ways, Cassian fits friendship to the new culture that he is helping to shape, a culture formed by the mind of Christ that also draws into obedience to Christ those elements of classical culture that were truly humane and deserving of being transmitted from age to age. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Thank you. You both met your time limits perfectly as the bells are chiming here. I appreciate that. We have some time for question before the reception. Nathan here, one of our graduate students, will hand you the mic if you have a question. Please identify yourself and your affiliation. And I also respectfully ask, no mini lectures, please. Just keep a nice, crisp question for Professor Johnson.
My name is Kirk Kramer. I'm a parishioner at St. James Church in Mount Rainier. Professor, does John Cassian or do the pagan writers that you spoke of, or more modern writers, speak of the possibility of
I'm sorry, my hearing is very bad, and so could you repeat the question?
Yes. Does John Cassian or do the pagan writers you spoke of, or more modern writers, maybe speaking of the same subject, talk about the possibility specifically of friendship between men and women, not marriage or parenthood?
No, John Cassian is addressing a specifically male monastic situation. And so this is a celibate community. There were communities of women in the desert, so we speak of the desert fathers and mothers, but that is not part of his purview. And indeed, I might mention, of course, the Greco-Roman ideal was entirely elitist and male. And the men didn't have any idea what the women were doing. And so, therefore, we don't have much idea what the women were doing because these were all male writers. So, so, I mean, they couldn't conceive, for example, Aristotle could not conceive of women being friends, or parents being friends with children, or slaves being friends. It was a completely sort of elitist sort of phenomenon. And of course, that's also one of the things that monastic culture broke down, because monks were not an elite kind of movement. They were ordinary folk, right, committed to Christ. Thank you. Somebody back there?
Thank you very much. I'm Mark Murphy. I'm in the philosophy department right over here. Thank you very much for that. That was a beautiful talk, and I really appreciate it. It struck me that there were two very different strands in Cassian's advice for the brothers. One was an anti-anger strand, talking about the perils and the difficulty that it generates in overcoming alienation. And the other is a humility strand. Yeah. It's about the strong being willing to, lower oneself. It's very anti-Aristotle. I mean, exactly. The magnanimous person claims for themselves, right? But saying that's not the idea. So, what I was wondering if you would comment on is the extent to which these can be fit into the idea of the pattern of Christ, because Christ's humility is super plain and relentless, but being anti-anger is not obvious. That Christ was not occasionally an angry person, and that anger was, and sometimes you might think that anger can be an act of humility. Instead of just blowing someone off, you actually respond to them in anger. So I'm wondering whether or not Cassian took this anti-anger ideal to be itself part of following the pattern of Christ, or whether it has a different kind of rationale.
I think your observation is very acute. The anti-anger part, and I'm puzzled over the lack of envy, as the Greco-Roman world did. I think envy is a greater destroyer of friendship even than anger. I think, and even in Cassian's Institutes, where he talks about the vices, right, the 7 deadly sins or whatever, he doesn't discuss envy. He has a tremendous amount to say about anger, so clearly on his mind. So part of this, and here's where the Greco-Roman strand is clearly not an evangelical strand, is the emphasis in Greco-Roman philosophy, especially in Stoicism, on apatheia, on the lack of disturbance, right? So that there is a value to being tranquil, just in itself, right? I mean, so that getting agitated, getting all het up about anything is not good for the soul, right? So where I think Cassian has that kind of strand, I think where he represents an advance is that he sees it in interpersonal terms. It's not just something that's happening to me, it's happening to the brother whom Christ loves, and I may be responsible for that. And even if I haven't caused it, even if my brother's anger at me is not justified, I still have an obligation to try to do that. But with regard to the second aspect, what strikes me in reading this conference, how profoundly Cassian grasped an element in Paul's letters that contemporary scholars miss completely. I mean, just this tremendous sense of his use of Romans and of 1 Corinthians and of Philippians, that at the heart of Christian existence is self-donative love, right? And that even if I'm stronger and I'm smarter and I know I'm right, I have to make every effort to try to, help my brother or sister where they are. And that humility, of course, is functional. It's not psychological. I'm not going to give up on the fact that I'm right. Certainly not me. But it is, when Paul says to look to the interests of others, and not simply your own. So it's not simply your own. It's not masochism. You have every right to have your position, to hold your interests, but you give it up, as Christ did, and being in the form of God, did not regard it as something to be grasped, but to give it up, right? And so that self-emptying is, I think, the dimension that Cassian really brings into the conversation. I don't know if even Augustine has something as good as this on that topic. I have to go see. Yes? You need a microphone. You need a microphone and I need a microphone.
Hi, Luke. I'm Bill Werpahowski. I teach in the theology.
How are you?
I'm fine.
I
How are
haven't
you?
seen you in 40 years.
I know.
You haven't aged a day.
No. Likewise, I'm sure. And Anne sends her best. To
Thank
you.
you.
Right.
Back to her, too.
Indeed. Luke, regarding the envy issue, I may be making Cassian more like Augustine here. But is it possible that the absence of this discussion of envy has something to do with the idea that there are certain goods that cannot be lost and certain goods that others might gain that can't reduce one's own self-esteem or one's own sense of self? So there's no good that can be lost that reduces one's own well-being because the love of God cannot be lost against one's will.
Yeah.
And there is no good that can be gained, if you will, at another's expense because of the fullness of the love of God.
Right.
I mean, at least as we're just trying to figure things out, is there something to this?
Yeah,
idea?
well, you know, I mean, I think a conversation between Cassian and Augustine is needed.
Is what?
Is needed. As far as I'm aware, they're not often put into conversation, you know, in a way, because Cassian's kind of regarded, well, he's that monk guy. And what I've tried to show is that, no, and of course, Augustine would not at all like the monkishness with regard to the Pelagianism and so forth, right? I mean, they would not agree on works righteousness, I think. But yeah, I mean, I think there are these echoes of a kind of Augustine stuff that we see. I'm more and more impressed all the time when I try to read in this early Christian literature I was just asked to do a point-by-point comparison between the letter to the Hebrews and the letter of James, and on the surface, there's just nothing in common. But when you dig deeper and you look at the fundamental convictions, there's just an astonishing coherence to all of the compositions in the New Testament. They really touch on the same points, even though they're just remarkably diverse, right? And I find the same thing in patristic writers, right? Clearly, we're not just dealing with a literary movement. We're dealing with shared life and experience, shared worship, shared prayer, and that affects everything. It's so good to see you.
Let us continue the conversation out in Dahlgren Quad with some wine and cheese. Luke, thank you for a marvelous
thank you.
lecture.